What happens when a mayor declares war on a 100-year-old church? And the Virgin Mary seems to answer back. The bulldozers were already hidden in the warehouse 2 blocks away. The demolition permits bore fresh ink, and Mayor Marcus Whitfield had convinced himself he was doing God's work by erasing the only sacred ground his town had ever known. He was wrong, but it would take a miracle to prove it. Don't miss what happened next. Hit like, share this story, and subscribe so you never miss the true accounts of faith, redemption, and the power of the sacred. Tucked between endless wheat fields and forgotten highways in rural Nebraska, the town of Mercy Falls was the kind of place where everyone knew your name and your sins. Population 2,847. 2 gas stations, 1 diner called Martha's that served the same meatloaf recipe for 30 years, and a church that had weathered more storms than most marriages. Our Lady of Sorrows Catholic Church dominated Main Street like a red brick fortress. Its twin spires reached toward heaven like praying hands, and the stained glass windows cast rainbow prayers across the weathered sidewalks. For 127 years, its bells had called farmers from their fields, mothers from their kitchens, and sinners from their beds. The church wasn't just a building. It was the town's heartbeat, its memory keeper, its anchor against the winds of change. Old Mrs. Catherine Murphy, who'd been the church organist for 43 years, often said the building had a soul. "You can feel it when you walk in," she'd tell visitors, her arthritic fingers still dancing across the keys during Sunday Mass. The walls remember every prayer, every tear, every moment of joy that's happened here. The Murphy family had been part of Our Lady of Sorrows since its founding. Catherine's great-grandfather had helped lay the cornerstone in 1897. Her grandfather had carved the wooden stations of the cross that lined the nave. Her father had donated the bronze bell that still rang every Sunday morning at exactly 8 a.m., calling the faithful to worship. 3 generations of Murphys lay buried in the cemetery behind the church, their graves marked by weathered stone angels and faded plastic flowers. Catherine knew that when her time came, she'd join them in that sacred ground, listening to the church bells ring for eternity. That was before Marcus Whitfield arrived with his modern ideas and ancient ambitions. Marcus swept into Mercy Falls like a salesman of progress disguised as a preacher. Tall, silver-haired, and polished, he'd built Renewal Community Church on the edge of town. All glass, steel, LED lights, and cup holders in the pews. His message was clear. God wanted prosperity, not incense and old stone walls. Without ever naming it, everyone knew his target was Our Lady of Sorrows, the 100-year-old Catholic church at the heart of town. His campaign for mayor was equally slick. While his opponent, farmer Harold Kowalski, promised to fix potholes, Marcus staged rallies, prayer breakfasts, and rolled out plans for spiritual renewal. He won in a landslide. From the start, he looked like a typical small-town mayor, cutting ribbons, handing out scholarships, shaking hands at parades. But under the surface, he was already moving pieces into place. Sarah Mitchell, the town librarian, was the first to see it. She had spent decades combing through city budgets and council records, unearthing past corruption no one else noticed. When the new budget crossed her desk, a single line stopped her cold. Downtown Revitalization. Phase 1, $2.3 million. She dug deeper. The plans showed a gleaming interfaith spiritual complex. Glass chapel, gardens, a conference center. But on the map, where Our Lady of Sorrows had stood for 127 years, only white space. A cleared site. Sarah's hands shook with anger as she printed every page. She had been baptized in that church. Her parents were married there. Her grandmother lay in the cemetery behind it. This wasn't revitalization. It was erasure. She stuffed the documents into a manila folder and drove straight to the rectory. Father Gabriel had to see what Marcus Whitfield was planning. Father Gabriel was bent over his small garden when Sarah Mitchell pulled into the rectory drive. One look at her face told him this wasn't a social call. Minutes later, the librarian's desk was spread across his office. Blueprints, budgets, and a line item that spelled doom. Downtown Revitalization. $2.3 million. The plans showed a glittering, interfaith spiritual complex, where Our Lady of Sorrows had stood for 127 years. Only white space. Cleared sight. "They can't just tear it down," Sarah said, her voice shaking. Father Gabriel's reply was calm, but his eyes were grave. "Marcus isn't just demolishing a building. He's trying to erase the faith that built this town." By evening, word had spread. The church basement filled with parish families, voices rising in grief and anger. Maria Santos recalled her grandmother's wedding there in 1943. Tom Bradley, a farmer whose father had laid bricks for the side chapel, stood and vowed, "Over my dead body are they going to knock down this place." But Catherine Murphy voiced the hard truth. Marcus had the council, the contracts, and the money. "What can we do?" Father Gabriel's answer was simple. "We fight on our knees." The next night, 12 people gathered with folding chairs and rosaries. By dawn, 37 knelt on the church steps. Thus began the night watch. Elena Rodriguez, 81, became its heart, arriving nightly with her lawn chair, thermos of coffee, and unshakable faith. "The Blessed Mother watched over Jesus," she told a reporter. "Now we watch over her house." Others followed. Robert Chen, a veteran, took the midnight shifts. "I didn't come home from war to see our church bulldozed," he said. Sister Catherine, a retired nun, came each night with her breviary and votive candles. Soon, the vigil became a living testimony. Not angry chants, but whispered prayers and flickering light. When asked what they hoped to achieve, Elena simply gestured to the Virgin Mary's marble statue beside the doors. "She's watched over this town for 127 years, she said. "The least we can do is watch over her now." Jack stayed longer than planned, struck by the vigil keeper's quiet conviction. These weren't zealots, but ordinary townsfolk. A pharmacist worried for her daughter, a retired mechanic, a young mother who credited her recovery from cancer to prayers at Our Lady of Sorrows. By the end of the first week, the vigil had rhythm. Families rotated shifts with military precision, bringing blankets, soup, and folding chairs. Local businesses pitched in. Martha's Diner delivered coffee, the hardware store donated heaters, the funeral home provided canopies. Support crossed faith lines. A Methodist pastor brought his youth group, a rabbi offered prayers, even members of Marcus's own church slipped by with food. By the second week, more than 100 people joined the watch. The local newspaper story spread to Lincoln, then to Catholic newswires, then to national and international outlets. Crews arrived from Rome, BBC radio broadcast from the church steps, and a German filmmaker called it the most authentic devotion I've ever seen. From his office, Marcus watched the coverage with growing fury. What was meant to be a simple development project had turned into a global spectacle, casting him as a villain. His phone rang non-stop with reporters. Council members grew uneasy, and even his wife pressed him to reconsider. That's when Marcus made his choice. He would escalate the fight. The first real clash came on a Tuesday night. A black pickup circled the church 3 times, engine roaring, before a beer bottle smashed against the Virgin Mary statue. The vigil keepers gasped, but Robert Chen snapped into soldier's mode. "Nobody's hurt," he said firmly. "We call the sheriff." This was intimidation. Sheriff Mike Torres arrived quickly, documenting the scene with care. "You have the right to pray," he told them, "but this is getting dangerous. Be cautious." The threats escalated. Graffiti reading, "Tear it down," smeared across the doors, nails scattered in the parking lot. Still, Father Gabriel preached calm. Violence is the language of fear. Our answer must be faith, love, and prayer. Marcus, meanwhile, tightened the screws. He called an emergency city council meeting with barely 2 days' notice, timed to cut into vigil hours. That Thursday, the chambers overflowed with townsfolk. Farmers, teachers, and parish families filled every seat, while Marcus's polished allies clustered near the front. From the dais, Marcus painted the vigil as lawlessness. For 3 weeks, protesters have occupied public property, disturbed the peace, and attracted outside agitators. Elena Rodriguez rose slowly, rosary in hand. "We are not protesters. We are parishioners at prayer, exercising our rights. We've broken no laws, threatened no one. Tom Bradley's booming voice cut in from the back. What business are you protecting, Mayor? The business of tearing down our church? Or the business of lining your brother-in-law's pockets? A murmur surged through the crowd. Marcus's smile froze, his mask slipping as whispers of corruption filled the room. That's when Marcus unveiled Ordinance 247B, an emergency ordinance for the prohibition of unauthorized public assembly on municipal property. Written in haste, it required permits for gatherings of more than 6 people, charged $500 a day, fined violators $500 each, and gave the mayor sole power to approve or deny applications. Marcus read it aloud, his voice heavy with authority. By the end, the chamber crackled with outrage. This is designed to stop our vigil, Sister Catherine said firmly. It applies equally to all, Marcus countered smoothly. Sarah Mitchell shot back. Then why weren't permits required for your campaign rallies in City Park? The room erupted. Everyone remembered those rallies. Marcus fumbled. Those were different circumstances. The mask slipped. The council passed the ordinance 5-2, Marcus's allies carrying the vote. As residents streamed out, the vigil keepers huddled on the steps, grim but resolute. They had 48 hours before the law took effect. Elena Rodriguez spoke for all of them. We don't stop praying. If we have to move to the sidewalk, so be it. But we will not abandon Our Lady. And so the vigil endured. The confrontation came at exactly 6:15 p.m. on Friday evening, just as the vigil keepers were arriving for their regular shift. 3 patrol cars lined Main Street, their red and blue lights casting an ominous glow over the church steps, where dozens of people had gathered for prayer every night for 3 weeks. Sheriff Mike Torres stepped out of the lead car with obvious reluctance, his uniform pressed and his badge polished, but his face showing the strain of a man being forced to enforce a law he privately opposed. Officer Dennis Murphy, a lifelong Catholic who'd been married in Our Lady of Sorrows 15 years earlier, flanked Torres's right side. Officer Janet Phillips, who'd grown up Methodist but whose grandmother had been one of the church's founding members, took position on the left. The vigil keepers were already in place, their folding chairs arranged in a semicircle around the statue of the Virgin Mary, their rosaries and prayer books ready for another night of devotion. Elena Rodriguez sat in her usual spot in the center, her weathered hands folded peacefully in her lap, her eyes fixed on the approaching officers with the calm dignity of someone who'd decided that some principles were worth suffering for. Folks, Sheriff Torres began, his voice carrying the weight of genuine regret. I'm sorry to have to do this, but as of 6 p.m. today, you're in violation of City Ordinance 247B. You have the right to continue your prayers, but you'll need to move to the public sidewalk across the street. Elena looked up at the sheriff, a man she'd known since he was a boy, whose mother she'd comforted during her final illness, whose children she'd taught in Sunday school, and spoke with the quiet authority of someone who'd spent 8 decades learning to distinguish between human law and divine law. Sheriff Torres, I baptized your youngest daughter in this church. I held your hand when you cried at your mother's funeral. I taught you your first prayers in the Sunday school classroom, right there in the basement. She paused, letting her words settle over the crowd that had gathered to witness this confrontation between civil authority and religious conscience. Now you're telling me I can't pray at my own church, the church where my husband and I were married 62 years ago, the church where I've worshipped every Sunday for 8 decades, the church where I hope to have my funeral mass when God calls me home. Torres's jaw tightened as he struggled with the conflict between his professional duty and his personal conscience. Mrs. Rodriguez, I understand your feelings, but I've got a job to do. The City Council has passed this ordinance, and it's my responsibility to enforce it. So was Pontius Pilate just doing his job when he ordered the crucifixion, replied Sister Catherine Walsh, her voice carrying 40 years of teaching authority. So were the Roman soldiers just following orders when they drove the nails into our Lord's hands. Officer Murphy, standing behind Torres, visibly winced at the comparison. He'd served as an altar boy in this very church, had received his first communion at this altar, had knelt in these pews every Sunday until he'd started working weekend shifts that conflicted with mass times. "Sister," he said, his voice tight with emotion, "please don't make this harder than it has to be. You have 15 minutes to gather your things and move across the street. After that, I'll have to start writing citations." What happened next would be talked about in Mercy Falls for generations. Instead of arguing or negotiating, instead of appealing to the officers' personal relationships or religious sympathies, the vigil keepers simply began to pray. Elena Rodriguez lifted her rosary and started the first Hail Mary in a voice that carried across the church steps and into the gathering darkness. "Hail Mary, full of grace, the Lord is with thee." One by one, the other vigil keepers joined in, their voices blending into a chorus of faith that rose above the flashing lights and official uniforms and bureaucratic ordinances. "Blessed art thou among women, and blessed is the fruit of thy womb, Jesus." Sheriff Torres found himself in an impossible position. He had a legal obligation to enforce the city ordinance, but he was facing down 81-year-old grandmothers and retired nuns who were committing the crime of praying at their own church. The scene was being recorded by news crews who'd arrived to cover the enforcement of the controversial ordinance. The optics were devastating, uniformed officers threatening to arrest elderly women for the crime of public prayer. "Holy Mary, Mother of God, pray for us sinners, now and at the hour of our death. Amen." As the first decade of the Rosary concluded, Elena looked up at Sheriff Torres with eyes that held no anger, no resentment, just the steady gaze of someone who'd made peace with the consequences of her convictions. "Sheriff, we're not going to resist arrest. We're not going to cause trouble or make your job any harder than it already is. But we're also not going to stop praying at our church. If you need to arrest us, we understand. But we won't abandon our post." Torres realized that he was trapped between an immovable object and an irresistible force. The vigil keepers were clearly violating the city ordinance, but arresting elderly women for praying would create a public relations disaster that could destroy his career and potentially provoke civil unrest in the community. He made a decision that reflected both his professional judgment and his personal conscience. "Folks," he announced, raising his voice so everyone could hear, "I'm going to give you one more opportunity to move across the street voluntarily. After that, I'll have to begin issuing citations for violation of City Ordinance 247B. But instead of moving, the crowd of vigil keepers actually grew larger. Word of the confrontation had spread through the community, and people were arriving to stand with their neighbours in what was rapidly becoming an act of mass civil disobedience. Tom Bradley parked his pickup truck and walked over to join the prayer circle, his weathered face set with determination. Maria Santos arrived with her teenage daughter, both of them carrying rosaries and prayer books. Father Gabriel emerged from the rectory wearing his clerical collar and carrying his breviary. "Sheriff," Father Gabriel said quietly, "these people are exercising their constitutional right to religious freedom. They're not blocking traffic, they're not disturbing the peace, and they're not threatening anyone. They're simply praying at their church." Torres felt the weight of every eye in the crowd, every camera lens pointed in his direction, every conscience in uniform standing behind him. He'd been sheriff for 12 years, and he'd never faced a situation that put him so directly between his professional duties and his personal values. He pulled out his citation book and began writing tickets. The first citation went to Elena Rodriguez, who accepted it with the same dignity she brought to everything in her life. She folded the paper carefully and placed it in her purse, then resumed her prayers as if nothing had happened. The second went to Sister Catherine Walsh, who looked at the fine amount, $500, and actually smiled. "Sheriff, I've been living on a nun's pension for 15 years. This fine represents about 3 months of my income, but some things are worth any sacrifice." By the time Torres had written 12 citations, word had spread throughout Mercy Falls and beyond. The scene was being broadcast live on social media, with viewers from around the world watching elderly Catholics being ticketed for the crime of public prayer. The hashtag praying grandmothers began trending on Twitter. Catholic news organizations picked up the story. Within hours, the images of uniformed officers writing citations to kneeling grandmothers were appearing on television screens across the country. But the most powerful moment came when Officer Dennis Murphy approached Catherine Murphy, the church organist and his own great-aunt, to write her citation. "Katie," he whispered, using the childhood nickname that only family members were allowed to use, "please don't make me do this. Please just move across the street." Catherine looked up at her grandnephew, this young man she'd helped raise after his parents died in a car accident when he was 14. This boy she'd taught to play piano on the church organ during countless summer afternoons. "Dennis," she said gently, "I taught you that sometimes doing what's right means accepting the consequences. I taught you that faith isn't just something you talk about on Sunday. It's something you live every day, even when it's difficult." She held out her hand for the citation. "I'm proud of you for doing your job, even when it breaks your heart. That takes courage. Now write me my ticket so I can get back to my prayers." Dennis Murphy's hands shook as he filled out the citation. When he handed it to his great-aunt, tears were streaming down his face. The vigil keepers didn't move across the street. They stayed exactly where they were, accepting their citations with grace and resuming their prayers as if the officers weren't even there. By 8 p.m., Torres had written 37 citations, totaling $18,500 in fines. The next morning, the story was front-page news from coast to coast. The demolition equipment arrived at dawn on a Wednesday, rolling down Main Street like an invading army. Sarah Mitchell was working the early morning vigil shift when the convoy of trucks rumbled past the church, their diesel engines drowning out the soft murmur of morning prayers. 2 flatbed trailers carried bulldozers that looked large enough to level city blocks. A massive crane followed, its boom folded but still towering over the church steeple like a mechanical vulture. Behind them came a parade of pickup trucks filled with workers in hard hats who studiously avoided making eye contact with the vigil keepers as they established their staging area in the vacant lot 2 blocks away. The sight broke something fundamental in the town's collective spirit. This wasn't about zoning laws or development permits anymore. This was about raw power, the kind of crushing, inexorable force that could grind sacred memories into dust and rubble. Sarah immediately called Father Gabriel, who arrived within minutes, still wearing his pajamas under a hastily thrown-on coat. Together, they watched as the machinery was unloaded and positioned with military precision. Surveyor flags had already been planted around the church property, their bright orange ribbons fluttering in the morning breeze like warnings no one had asked for. "How long do we have?" Sarah asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Father Gabriel consulted the legal documents that the church's attorney had been studying for weeks. According to the demolition order, they can begin work next Monday. 5 days. Word spread through Mercy Falls with the speed that only devastating news can achieve. By noon, the church basement was packed with parishioners, community supporters, and reporters from 3 states. The atmosphere was charged with the desperate energy of people who'd run out of legal options and were facing the destruction of something irreplaceable. "We've filed every appeal, pursued every legal avenue," announced David Chen, the church's attorney and Robert Chen's older brother. "The courts have ruled that the city has the authority to condemn the property for public use, and they've defined the spiritual complex as serving the public good." A woman in the back of the room began to cry. Tom Bradley slammed his fist on a folding table, making everyone jump. Sister Catherine Walsh closed her eyes and began praying silently, her lips moving without sound. Father Gabriel stood up and walked to the front of the room, his presence somehow calming the desperate energy that threatened to boil over into panic or rage. "We need to be very clear about what we're facing," he said, his voice steady despite the magnitude of the crisis. "On Monday morning, they're going to come with bulldozers and tear down this church. They have the legal authority to do it, they have the political support to do it, and they have the financial resources to do it." He paused, looking around at faces that had become as familiar to him as his own family over 15 years of ministry. "But we have something they don't have. We have faith, we have community, and we have the absolute certainty that some things are too sacred to be destroyed by earthly power, no matter how overwhelming that power might seem." Elena Rodriguez, sitting in the front row with her ever-present rosary, raised her arthritic hand. "Father, what exactly are you saying? Are you telling us to give up?" "I'm telling you that we're about to find out what our faith is really worth," Father Gabriel replied. For the past month, we've been praying and protesting and petitioning and pleading. Now, we're down to the most fundamental question any believer ever faces. Do we really trust God, or do we only trust God when things are going our way? That evening, something unprecedented happened in the history of Mercy Falls. Father Gabriel held what he called a prayer for divine intervention, and people came from hundreds of miles away to participate. The church was packed beyond capacity, with the overflow crowd filling the parish hall, the basement, and the parking lot. Speakers had been set up so that everyone could hear the service, which Father Gabriel had structured as a combination of traditional Catholic liturgy and desperate petition for miraculous intervention. We gather tonight not to ask God to change his will, Father Gabriel announced to the assembled multitude, but to align our will with his, whatever that might mean for our beloved church. The service lasted 3 hours and included some of the most heartfelt prayers, most beautiful music, and most sincere spiritual testimony that anyone present had ever experienced. Catherine Murphy played hymns on the ancient organ with a passion that made the rafters ring. The church choir, augmented by singers who'd driven from as far away as Denver and Chicago, performed sacred music that seemed to lift the entire building closer to heaven. But it was the testimony of ordinary parishioners that moved people to tears and transformed the evening from a religious service into something approaching mystical experience. Maria Santos spoke about how the church had sustained her family through her husband's deployment in Iraq, her mother's battle with Alzheimer's, and her own struggle with breast cancer. "This building isn't just bricks and mortar to us," she said, her voice carrying to every corner of the packed sanctuary. "It's where we meet God, where we find hope, where we remember that we're part of something larger than our individual struggles." Tom Bradley, who rarely spoke publicly about anything more personal than crop rotations and cattle prices, stood up and shared how he'd found the strength to continue farming through the devastating drought of 2012 by attending early morning mass every day, sitting in the same pew where his father had taught him to pray during the Great Depression. "I'm 71 years old," he said, his weathered voice cracking with emotion. "I've buried my parents, my wife, and too many good friends in the cemetery behind this church. When my time comes, I want to be laid to rest in that sacred ground, knowing that my children and grandchildren will still be able to visit this holy place where our family has worshipped for 4 generations." But it was young Tommy Santos, Maria's 8-year-old son, who provided the evening's most powerful moment. As the service was drawing to a close, he suddenly stood up in his pew and walked to the front of the church, his small figure dwarfed by the massive altar and the towering statue of the Virgin Mary. "Can I say something?" he asked Father Gabriel, his clear child's voice carrying through the silent sanctuary. Father Gabriel knelt down to Tommy's level and nodded encouragingly. Tommy turned to face the crowd, his hands clasped in front of him the way his Sunday school teacher had taught him. "I know I'm just a kid," he began, "but I want everyone to know that this is Jesus' house. And Jesus loves everyone, even the people who want to tear it down. My mom says we should pray for them too, because maybe they don't understand how special this place is." He paused, looking up at the statue of the Virgin Mary with the absolute faith that only children possess. "I asked Jesus and his mom to please save our church, and I think they will, because they love us and they know how much this place means to us. We just have to keep praying and believing, even if it looks scary with all those big machines outside." Tommy walked back to his pew as naturally as he'd approached the altar, leaving behind a silence that felt charged with possibility and hope. The service ended with the entire congregation singing "Amazing Grace" in voices that seemed to shake the foundations of the building. As people began to file out into the night, many stopped to touch the walls, to genuflect before the altar, to leave flowers at the statue of the Virgin Mary, instinctively understanding that this might be their last opportunity to worship in the church that had sheltered their faith for over a century. But the vigil keepers didn't leave. As they had every night for 5 weeks, they took their positions on the church steps and began their prayers, rosaries clicking softly in the darkness, votive candles flickering like stars in the Nebraska night. None of them knew that they were about to witness a miracle that would transform not just their struggle, but their understanding of how God works in the world. Friday, October 15th, 2:47 a.m. Frost coated the church steps where 8 vigil keepers braved the freezing night. Robert Chen with soldierly alertness, Sister Catherine praying her rosary, Elena Rodriguez's granddaughter Monica standing in her place, and the others who refused to abandon their post. Then the world fell silent. No wind, no highway noise, not even the grain elevator hum. Their candles flickered out one by one, and flashlights refused to work. That's when they heard it, the heavy oak doors creaking open. The chains remained locked, yet both doors swung inward without a sound. A wave of warmth rolled out, carrying the sense of spring and home. Inside glowed a light not of bulbs, but of something living, soft as stained glass at dawn. The vigil keepers fell to their knees and prayed while the glow deepened, and a sound like singing, not music, not words, but pure comfort, filled the air. They prayed until sunrise, numb from the cold, yet full of peace. At 6:30, Father Gabriel arrived to find the doors wide open, though still chained. He stepped inside and froze. The sanctuary was carpeted with roses. Thousands of perfect white blooms spiraled toward the Virgin Mary, whose statue seemed to shine with its own light. Fresh, fragrant, still warm, as if plucked from summer gardens, they lay too many and too perfectly placed to be human hands' work. The 8 witnesses followed, stunned silent. Father Gabriel lifted one blossom to his nose, then heard Sister Catherine whisper the only words that fit the moment. "This is the Lord's doing, and it is marvelous in our eyes." By 10 a.m., word of the roses had swept far beyond Mercy Falls. By noon, local news crews were live on the church steps. By nightfall, pilgrims were arriving from across the country. CNN called it a modern miracle in Nebraska. The Catholic press sent reporters from Rome. Even secular outlets admitted the event defied explanation. From his City Hall office, Marcus Whitfield watched in growing dread. His phone rang non-stop. Panicked council members, worried contractors, reporters hounding his family, and even allies from Renewal Community Church asking if God himself might be against their plans. Marcus had built his career on facts, contracts, and control. Roses blooming in a locked church in midwinter fit none of those categories. He tried to dismiss it as a hoax, duplicate keys, collusion by Catholics, a staged stunt. But the footage showed locked chains, sincere witnesses, and roses that looked impossibly fresh, glowing with their own light. As doubt crept in, his wife Patricia confronted him that evening. A doctor and woman of science, she had supported his modernization crusade, but also sensed his methods had gone too far. "Marcus," she asked quietly, "when was the last time you actually prayed?" The question left him speechless. He realized that somewhere along the way, prayer had become performance, not communion. That night, restless and shaken, Marcus made his choice. He dressed, got in his car, and drove through the empty streets toward the church that had just turned his life, and his entire vision for Mercy Falls, upside down. At 2:30 a.m., only a dozen vigil keepers remained on the church steps, their whispered prayers rising in the cold air when Marcus's black sedan appeared. He sat motionless beneath the street lamp before finally crossing the road with hesitant steps. Elena Rodriguez whispered, "He's come to see for himself." The doors of Our Lady of Sorrows stood open, chains still locked but meaningless after the miracle. Marcus paused, glanced back at the praying figures, then stepped inside. The roses were overwhelming, carpeting the floor, filling the air with fragrance, transforming the sanctuary into something unearthly. But it wasn't only the sight. The presence in the church pressed against him like a hand on his shoulder, charged with love and certainty. Isabella Martinez, tending the flowers, slipped quietly into the side chapel as Marcus walked down the aisle, his expensive coat and political bearing looking strangely small among the impossible beauty. He stopped before the marble Virgin, her face of carved compassion seeming to see through him. He tried to cling to skepticism. But in this place, where doors had opened themselves and roses bloomed in winter, his cynicism cracked. "Why?" his voice echoed. "Why do they love you so much? Why do they risk everything for stone and superstition?" He stepped closer, anger rising. "I offered them progress, prosperity, the future. And they choose this? He slammed his fist against the altar, the sound thundering through the rose-scented silence. That's when the world changed again. A warmth began to fill the sanctuary. Not the artificial heat of a building's climate control system, but something organic and alive that seemed to rise from the roses themselves. The statue's marble eyes, which had gazed serenely at generations of worshippers, began to change, opening slightly as if awakening from a deep sleep. A soft light began to emanate from within the stone, growing brighter but never harsh, illuminating the sanctuary with the warm glow of perfect love made visible. The roses around the altar began to glow as well, their petals seeming to pulse with the same gentle radiance that was transforming the statue from carved stone into something undeniably alive. Marcus staggered backward, raising his hands instinctively as his rational mind struggled to process what his eyes were witnessing. His mouth opened, but no sound emerged as every defense he'd built against the supernatural collapsed in the face of impossible beauty. Then he heard it, not with his ears, but with his heart. Not as words, but as pure meaning that bypassed his conscious mind and spoke directly to his soul. Do not touch what is sacred, my child. This house is not yours to command. The voice was feminine, infinitely gentle, and filled with the kind of love that Marcus had spent his entire life seeking through achievement, accumulation, and the exercise of power over others. It was the voice of every mother who'd ever comforted a frightened child, every grandmother who'd ever offered wisdom to a confused young man, every woman who'd ever seen potential for good in someone who'd lost his way. Marcus fell to his knees as if his legs had been cut from under him. Every wall he'd built around his heart, every cynical defense against faith, every carefully constructed barrier between himself and the sacred collapsed in a single moment of recognition. He wept, ugly, gasping sobs that came from a place deeper than his lungs, older than his memories, more fundamental than his carefully crafted identity as a successful man who had everything under control. For the first time in decades, Marcus Whitfield was in the presence of something infinitely larger and more powerful than himself. And instead of the judgment he expected, he found only love. Love that saw every mistake he'd made, every person he'd hurt, every sacred thing he'd tried to destroy, and loved him anyway. Love that offered forgiveness before he even knew how to ask for it. Love that saw not the enemy of faith he'd become, but the child of God he'd always been, hidden beneath layers of ambition and pride and the desperate need to prove himself worthy of attention. In that moment of absolute vulnerability, kneeling on a floor covered with miraculous roses, surrounded by light that had no earthly source, Marcus Whitfield encountered the God he'd been running from his entire life, and found that he'd been waiting patiently for this moment since the beginning of time. Isabella found him an hour later, still kneeling among the roses. The light had faded, but the presence in the sanctuary remained. "Sir?" she whispered. Marcus turned, and she gasped at the change in his face. The ambition was gone, replaced by peace and clarity. "She spoke to me," he said softly. "After everything I tried to destroy, she still called me her child." He looked around the church he'd once condemned, then rose unsteadily. "I need to make this right." Isabella steadied him. "Forgiveness is the first step," she said, "and I think you've already received it." At dawn, Marcus slipped past the vigil keepers in silence. They saw it in him. The man who'd been their enemy was no longer a threat. For 3 days, he disappeared from public life. No statements, no calls, no press conferences. Rumors swirled, a breakdown, an escape, the end of his career. But Isabella kept his secret, and the roses stayed miraculously fresh. Then, on Sunday morning, Marcus Whitfield stunned Mercy Falls more than the miracle itself. He went to Mass. Marcus didn't slip in quietly. At 9:55 a.m., 5 minutes before Mass, he walked through the front doors of Our Lady of Sorrows, wearing a simple wooden cross and carrying a single white rose. The packed church fell silent as he moved down the aisle, past faces that shifted from shock to hope. At the altar, Father Gabriel paused. Their eyes met, a silent exchange of forgiveness and surrender. Marcus took a seat in the back pew beside Elena Rodriguez, the vigil leader who looked at him not with anger, but recognition of change. The Mass unfolded as usual, though everyone knew it was anything but ordinary. Surrounded by roses that had miraculously endured, they listened as Father Gabriel preached on true conversion. Not theatrics, but the quiet surrender to God's love. His words seemed to land directly on Marcus. When communion came, Marcus stayed seated, but parishioners acknowledged him with nods, touches, even smiles. Gestures of forgiveness moved him to tears. Afterward, instead of leaving, he knelt before the Virgin Mary's statue, laying down his rose among the miraculous blossoms. Father Gabriel found him still praying. "Marcus," he said softly, "is there something you'd like to talk about?" The mayor looked up, eyes red. "Father, how do I make this right? I tried to destroy what you've built." "Conversion isn't about erasing the past," the priest replied. "It's about letting God write a new story. You're still the same leader, but now you understand that true authority comes from service." That afternoon, Marcus called a press conference. The steps of City Hall had never seen such a crowd. Reporters swarmed alongside hundreds of residents and pilgrims, waiting to hear the mayor's response to the miracle at Our Lady of Sorrows. At exactly 2 p.m., Marcus appeared, not with advisors, but with his wife, daughter, and elderly mother. He carried no speech, only a manila folder. "3 days ago," he began, "I believed progress meant tearing down the past. I was wrong. Friday night, I knelt in that church and asked God why people risk everything for their faith. He answered me in a way I will never forget. He pulled out the papers. Effective immediately, the Mercy Falls Revitalization Project is terminated. All contracts cancelled. Demolition permits void. Our Lady of Sorrows will be designated a protected landmark." The crowd fell silent as he raised his voice. "This isn't politics. Some things are too sacred to be measured in dollars. This community has taught me that the future worth building is one that honors the sacred, not destroys it." He drew a small wooden cross from his pocket. "I don't know what the rest of my term looks like, but I will spend it protecting what I once tried to erase." The crowd responded not with cheers, but with reverent silence, until 8-year-old Tommy Santos pushed forward. "Mr. Mayor," he asked, "does this mean Jesus gets to keep his house?" Marcus knelt, tears in his eyes. "Yes, Tommy, Jesus gets to keep his house. And so do all who love him." The boy hugged him, and the cameras captured the moment that became the enduring image of Mercy Falls, a child's faith sealing the redemption of a mayor.